As I was saying, there's a great parallel between the history of the Roman trajectory and that of the Roman Empire, and the American historical trajectory, and that's what I'd like to take up with you. In the context of my work, it's what I call the United States of America, so it's what I call Civilization B. I'd like to remind all kind listeners that when I talk about these things, which are very fundamental to my work, in the base, you'll find a reminder with a few maps, which is very quick to read. On the front page of my website, historionomy.net, you'll go to what is historionomy, and you'll find a whole reminder on what I call the ABCD civilization, the ABCD cycle. And this will enable you to follow when I talk about it. You don't really see what it is at a glance, you'll realize. Now, it's not necessary to know the detail, because the idea is to know what characterizes these trajectories civilized and how fitting America into this category allows us to envisage, and above all, the tensions that exist today. So what you need to know, what I call civilization very quickly, is that like Rome and the United States, it's a civilization that's an emanation of what I call civilization A. So it's about Greece for the antiquity, concerns Greece for antique Europe for modern times. Since the Middle Ages, it's an emanation that ends up becoming as great a power in its own right by being a single political community than the entire civilization of such and such a life. Rome, which on its own became as powerful as the whole of Greece or the United States, which today is as powerful, if not more powerful than Europe as a whole, and which ends up dominating its power, going beyond this original power A to dominate the whole world, including, for example, the lands of civilization C, which is what I talked about in my last program on Islam. So what characterizes these states? First and foremost, they are colonial offshoots of civilization. This is the case of the United States, of course. This is obviously the case of the United States, which is essentially a colony of Northern Europe, in particular England, but also the Netherlands, since you know that New York was originally New Amsterdam. I don't know how it's pronounced in Dutch. New Amsterdam was originally a Dutch colony. The geographer Strabo, a few centuries later, referred to Rome as a Hellenic city. In other words, a city of Greek culture. The Etruscans were a people who lived in what is now Tuscany, in northern Italy, and therefore directly north of Rome. But what you need to know is that among the kings of Greece, you had one Tarquin the Elder from memory, who was the son of a Greek immigrant from Corinth. It's likely that at least part of Rome's ruling class in very ancient times was made up of Greek immigrants. So we also have this colonial link, but essentially Rome was born as a dependency of the Etruscans. So we're talking about the 7th, 6th century BC. So Rome was integrated. It was a kind of dominion of Etruscan, and in the same way that the United States was dominated by Etruscans, just as the United States was a dominion of England, a series of colonies, and both were marked by what I call an independence revolution. I told you a little about this in the very first program, which I talked about what I called the national revolution, which comes at the end of the construction of a nation state and transforms a sovereign monarchy into a parliamentary regime that is then destined to become democratic. This was the case with the English Revolution in the 17th century, the French Revolution, the German Revolution, etc. What I call an independence revolution is different. The American Revolution, what we might call the Roman Revolution, the establishment of the Republic by the kings who were ousted in 510 BC, are precisely related to this. This is also what happened in other countries such as the United Provinces, which were formerly possessions of Holland and the surrounding provinces, were possessions, Habsburgs of Spain, for a very long time, and gained their independence. See, this was also the case for Venice in the 10th century in relation to the Byzantine Empire, or the city of Genoa. So these independence revolutions have a different structure to work. Like, in other words, you have a small political entity that is subject to a larger entity, but very distant from the heart, the large of which is a part of the larger entity on which it depends, and therefore develops a strong entity of its own. This is the case, the United States, between England and the United States, between the colony, the 13 colony, between England and the United States, which had the Atlantic Ocean. It was also the case, for example, of the United Provinces, which had the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of Spain and Holland. So we weren't at all on the same language, we weren't at all on the same culture. After that, we weren't even on the same religion, since those provinces had become Protestant. So once this identity had become sufficiently differentiated, an abuse of authority by the metropolis was bound to produce a rebellion, usually linked to taxation or a desire for centralization. Always something like that happens. In Rome, for example, it was one of Etruscan kings who had power. It's called Les Tartines Superbes, but it's the same mechanism. So you have a phase of warfare that makes it possible to obtain the independence of the political entity. And the very nature of this conflict, which is a national conflict, and which is that of a population rebelling to obtain independence, and so, by its very nature, creates a specific mentality, which is always the same, which is that the nation is perceived as an association of sovereign individuals in opposition to a foreign power. And so we're onto something different compared to what I used to call national revolutions, where there's no such such struggle for sovereignty. Sovereignty has already been acquired in national revolutions, but the independence revolution is different, and so it creates a different political. We have individuals simply because they are people who are obliged to fight together, to fight against the suzerain as against the occupier. And that's why in the population of the country in question, which is carrying out independence revolution, you have a particularly strong alliance collaboration, which is necessary during the war between all social classes. Between the elites who are rich, between the people who are the poorest, everyone is obliged to work together to achieve the beat. And that creates a political relationship that's completely different traditional country, where you necessarily have a hierarchy with a form of social distance, and where you have, for example, the aristocracy country may feel closer to the aristocracy by talent than to its own population. It's different. A revolution or independence where it creates a strong political community, and so it favors the establishment of a political order that will be more favorable to freedom than else. Often this is an oligarchic democratic regime. This is the case of the Great Maritime Republic, Venice. This is the case of the United Provinces. This soon became less the case state was at first, because the right to vote wasn't as widespread. It expanded rapidly, but basically it was a censal right, and it was really the aristocrat characters, very wealthy people, who led the revolution and governed. Washington was the richest planter in Virginia. It's the same thing in Rome. Since the patrician was a senate that already existed under the monarch, the senate would become Rome's ruling oligarchy, but with a democratic element that would gradually take hold. I'll come back. This regime guaranteed fundamental freedom and established a relatively liberal economic order, since individuals were respected, as were property rights, and it gives a particular dynamism to states, which, even if they are smaller than the others, are mechanically small, because at the base they depended on a state which was larger. So inevitably, when they gain their independence, they are smaller in size than. The result is a republic of citizens. Of course, the difference between the United Provinces, example, and the United States of America is that the United Provinces appeared in 16th century Europe, surrounded by great powers, so they had no room for development. On the other hand, a power like the United States emerged on a continent that wasn't untouched by the Indian, but which didn't have any strong nations opposing it, so it had an extraordinary space for development, and that's what characterizes civilization. B, in fact, is that it's an independence revolution that takes place in territory that offers absolutely enormous possibility for development, with a dimension that exceeds that of the territory of the original civilization, which is what I call civil. And this was also the case for the Romans, even if they were surrounded by small city-states, but Etruria wasn't really an empire. It was a collection of city-states that were all Etruscan culture, but which had no centralized leadership, so all the other were roughly the same size as Rome itself taken. So, by driving out these Etruscan kings, and once again becoming an independent republic, it opened up a very important area for growth. So, without following a series of wars of independence, independence isn't acquired immediately, it requires repeated wars. So there were other wars against the Etruscans for the Romans. There were other wars, notably their War of 12, which is sometimes called the Second American War of Independence, the British, during which they tried to drive the British out of North America altogether by taking Canada from them, but they did succeed. Thanks to this second war, they were able to impose themselves and convince England to completely return to the United States. England, to get back into the game. So you have this young republic which is dynamic, which has a potential for growth, and which is going to start expanding and developing the territory open to it, in fact. And what characterizes this in particular, here I'm introducing a little notion that I'll be replacing, you'll see regularly in broadcasts, what I call geographical research. In my work, comparative work, there's one criterion I regularly take out, which is the similarity of geographies, and so it can be on different scale. We'll see that this is the case here. Between two civilizations belonging to the same category. If you take Rome, it was born and developed on a peninsula, the Italian peninsula, which meant it was relatively sheltered from all the great powers of the world, from all the great powers of the time. On one side you had Greece, on the other you had Carthage, which was in full development, but in the meantime, Italy, so it's a peninsula wedged between two seas, which shelters it strategically, leaving a truly secure development space cut off from the rest of the world for what I call civilization. The same applies to the United States, which is protected by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So in both cases, you end up with a fairly natural development area, which for Rome, the Italian peninsula, and for the United States, which was quite simply the current American territory, from one side to the other. For a while, they wanted to take over Canada, but they couldn't. It was their northern limit. But then they had a space from coast to coast that seemed like a natural space. Before coming to the question of how this natural space was conquered, I'd like to come back to the question of the political system. I mentioned a fairly liberal political system that protects individual freedom. In particular, this political system is characterized on both sides by the will, which again is a historical legacy from the origins, i.e. the refusal of founding independence, the founding struggle for independence, which is the refusal of any new power that would be considered tyrannical. So, with the Romans, this gave rise to the Roman Constitution, with its 2 consuls and systematically dual magistracies to prevent one of the 2 establish a particular power. And it's a phenomenon that grew and multiplied as these institutions were perceived by the plebs, which were made up of people who weren't nobles, who weren't patricians, who weren't large landowners, small landowners, or the clients of large land worked for them, their trade, etc. Or people who had immigrated to Rome. It derived its independence. Thanks to the rights it granted its citizens, it drew the willingness to come and work from Latium, the region around Rome, people with close ethnic ties. You had what is known as the War of the Order, i.e. between the plebs and the patricians, through which the plebs obtained more and more rights, which correspond somewhat to the extension of the right to vote in the United. And this struggle led to the plebs themselves to obtain their own magistrate, who were once again, to a certain extent, those who were consuls for the aristocracy. So that's how the plebeian tribunes came into being. I'll make this intro and talk about it later. It was the plebs who represented in turn the consuls and the other edifice, this institutional duality that had to preserve the rights of individuals, the rights of the population, make up this very particular system of the Roman Republic, while at the same time preserving the rights of the people of the Roman Republic, all power and counterpower. And we can see exactly the same thing with the Americans, since the whole system of the American Constitution, as it was originally drafted with all its checks and balances, is exactly the same fundamental idea that was to prevent the advent of any tyranny. Always mitigate all powers, mix them up a little, balance them to prevent tyranny from setting. And in both cases, this results in constitutions that are very cobbled together and not at all well thought out from the outset. In France, we've often tried to do just that, to create constitutions that are very well thought out. It's our taste for the system. In reality, whether in Rome or in the United States, they're really cobbled together pieces of work that have been put together bit by bit, but which have been thought through like that and which have held together for centuries, virtually untouched. The stability of the American Constitution is absolutely remarkable, but so was the stability of the Roman Constitution, which lasted for almost 500 years. It's a record, then, that has yet equaled by the American. I'm not sure it ever will. Interestingly, the great promoter of checks and balances, Alexander Hamilton, had published articles to promote the Constitution, to encourage its adoption in a journal called the Federalists, which later became the Ripper Federalists, and which still has a certain authority today, since it's considered to be able to interpret the Constitution. He had written these texts. Other authors, John Jay and Madison, and they had the peculiarity, these texts, of being written under a single name, which was a pseudonym. It was the pseudonym Publius Hamilton, taken precisely in honor of Publius Valerius, who was one of the first leaders of the Roman Republic. So he felt this filiation and parallel between their construction and that of the Romans. So much for the basic institutional aspect. Now let's look at how these nations are built, since, as I said, we have an original settlement that obtains independence and then seeks to impose itself on a territory that seems natural to it. Italy for Rome, the United States for whom else? That's the question he's asked. So for the 13 colonies, yes, but it's still a little different, I'd like to say, because we really get to the bottom of things. The reality, it seems to me, is that the exact correspondence with Rome isn't so much the United States as it is the northeastern United States. Guillaume can show you the map of the northern United States. Remember to like the video as he does it. Here it is, the northeastern United States. That's it. Is this you? Yes, perfect. That's everything in dark red. In stripes, there's what's sometimes included, sometimes not, which corresponds to Virginia and West Virginia. So if you add to that the 3 states below, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, you have all 30 colonies, except that the 3 states below aren't. And the people of this northeast, apart from Virginia, because we don't really count them in, are what we usually call Yankee. Yankee comes from an... So there are different exact etymologies, but in general it was used to designate the Dutch populations, i.e. those who were essentially was first names in general, and in particular Yannick. We don't really, it's a diminutive of Cornelius. It's a diminutive of Jan Cornelius or Yannick, which in itself is a Dutch, so it's Dutch. A Dutch first name, and so it was a slightly pejorative designation of the populations. I told you earlier that New York was originally New Amsterdam, and that it was conquered by the English during Anglo-Dutch Wars. Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 7th century. That's why we often talk about Yankees when we talk about American, because if you look at the history of Civilization B, there's an important stage, part of the conquest of this natural space. It's a war in which the heart of civilization will confront simultaneously, and even after it has already united them the first time, a large part of the forces that were subject to it, and that populate this territory. It's a bit abstract put like that, but very simply, in the United States, this is what we call the Civil War, and in Rome, because there's equivalent, what we call the Social War, which took place between XXX and XXVIII BC. BC. What does it consist of? Quite simply, you need to know that Rome, in the same way as the United States, achieved Italian unity through a kind of federalism. In other words, Rome regularly clashed with neighboring cities and signed treaties with them. So either they were allies who gradually, as Rome's power grew, found themselves in a relationship of inequality, initially an alliance on an equal footing, and then Rome became so much more powerful that they found themselves little vassals, or they were outright enemies who were forced into a treaty after being defeated. And so the Romans created the institution of the municipate, which was to give a certain number of rights to the cities, to give a sort of second-class citizenship, or outright give full citizenship to a certain part of the elite of these societies in order to bind them to Rome. And that's how, in the 1st century BC, we arrived at a Rome that ruled the whole of the Italian peninsula, which was a kind of federation around Rome, all the cities of the peninsula. The problem was, however, that the populations of the rest of it were beginning to resent the fact that they didn't have the same rights as Roman citizens. Why was this? Quite simply because during the great wars of the previous 2 centuries, in particular all the Punic wars against Carthage and certain wars in the East, the people of the rest of Italy had not been able to enjoy the same rights as Roman citizens. East, which had considerably enriched the Roman elites, a large proportion of the troops sent into battle. Into battle were Italian auxiliaries fighting alongside the Roman legions, and who often in the end made up the bulk of the army's strength. You had the core of the Roman legion. With them, you had Italian auxiliaries. And so all these Italians were a little fed up with fighting on behalf of Rome and enriching and increasing Rome's power without enjoying full rights and equal treatment in return. And this degenerated at the beginning of the 1st century BC. I've given you the dates when, quite simply, some of these cities began to secede and created a confederation of Italian cities with a capital, which they called Italica, which was in Cortinium, and which had a constitution that mirrored that of Rome. So it's not a constitution in the modern sense that we wrote, but in fact it's imitating Roman institutions, but separate from them. And so there was a war, just like that, between Rome and the cities that were loyal to it, the federated cities, and this confederation of Italian cities. And here I think you can see the strong parallel with the American Civil War, which is the equivalent in the United States. The American Civil War, you can see what happened in ancient Greece with the Peloponnesian Wars, I believe. Peloponnese, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. The Peloponnesian War is different. The Peloponnesian War was a war between 2 powers, Athens and Sparta, who each had their allies, of course. And in fact, well, I'm not going to go too far into the parallel. I'm not going to delve too far into the parallel, the exercise, the law of history, because there are indeed parallels, the American Civil War between the more terrestrial power, the more commercial, etc. But I'd rather not go into that. But well, I'd rather not go into that territory because it's going to... But in fact, as we often see in my work, you have categories and subcategories. You have events that can often be found that take on a different meaning when taken together. For example, I was talking earlier about the independence revolution, a subcategory. You have a whole bunch of independence revolutions, and most independence revolutions don't result in a civilization. But when it's carried out under the right, it's a category. But when it's done under the conditions I mentioned earlier, on an independent territory, etc., that's where you get a B civil. Agreed? Right then. In the same way, when you have major civilizational antagonism between 2 political powers, the result is a war that always has more or less the same structure. But in some cases, it's a war between great powers, and in other cases, it's the equivalent of a civil war. Do you agree? That's what's happening in the United States and what was happening on the Roman model. So, as I was saying, what is the American Civil War? It's crucial to understand, because often, well, when we look at the American Civil War, in Europe, we get the impression that there was a North and a South, that there were great differences in civilization. The problem is that, as we understand it in France, we have the impression that it's a different kind of gulf that appeared in the decades following the revolution, and which created this kind of problem. But in fact, that's not the case. The reality is that this distinction already existed when independence was achieved, and it already existed for that, right? The culture is different in the North. The North was more numerous Puritan who had fled persecution, who'd fled religious persecution, and who come to gain religious tolerance and freer and so on. In the South, it was a little different. It was very much the legacy of colonies that had been launched by the aristocracy or by wealthy merchants who weren't fleeing persecution. So already we weren't dealing with the same mentality of the people who had arrived. Secondly, in the North, farming was difficult, so they were quick to turn to trade, resource exploitation, timber, etc., while in the South, farming was more difficult. Whereas in the South, the plantation economy and the slave economy were... It's important to understand that slavery took root in the South for 2 reasons. Firstly, there was a predisposition to slavery, which was that, as I said, it wasn't the same mentality of the colonists, and the Puritans of the North were less likely likely to seek slavery than people who were doing the persecuting, whereas the people who came to the South really came to exploit land, resources, make tobacco plantations, etc. Already. These were people with a mentality more disposed to exploitation, especially human exploitation, i.e. the purchase of slaves and the use of slaves. But more than that, the plantation business itself is much more compatible, and much more, obviously, on the road to slavery, which is different from trade. It's very rare for slaves to be used for trade. Trade is all about free men. On the other hand, labor can be exploited on plantations. So there's a very important first difference. This difference existed at the time of independence. This independence, to reiterate a few things about it began, all the colonies were upset by the new taxes that England wanted to introduce. In particular, she wanted to implement this taxation. England felt it was justified because during the 7 Years' War, which I mentioned for other reasons, there were two issues that had been won by England. There had been fighting in North America that had defeated the French in particular. The Americans had fought alongside the English against the French. This was the subject of the Crown. But the British Crown felt that it had helped its colonists by investing, by sending troops to defend them, etc. But that this had cost it dearly. But it had cost them a lot of money, so they had to pay back a little. She had to ask them to contribute, and she taxed them. That's what taxation is all about. Well, nobody liked it, and the people in the South didn't like it as much as the North. But in spite of everything, it must be said that it was from the North that the rebellion started. That during the first years of the rebellion and the first British intervention, the entire army insurgents were people from the North, from New England. New England, which is still the northernmost half of the North, to put it simply, that the French, by the way, called them Bostonians. Tell you where they came. Of the 7 founding fathers, the main founding fathers of the United States, you have 4 who are from the northern United States, namely Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. The last being Jefferson, Washington, and Madison, all of whom came from Virginia. So Virginia, you see, is still a little bit counted in the northern states, in the northeastern states today. So at the time and during the Secession War, we'll come back to that later, Virginia was part of the southern states. Washington and Jefferson were planters after all. So they were more into the southern way of life. And so from the outset, this had a major influences. Since when the United States of America was created, of United States of America, when the Constitution was drafted and the first years of the United States life were spent, you had a completely different vision of what the United States should be. You have, so what makes it possible to synthesize it? It's two, yes. So I'll tell you one last word. So among the people who wrote precisely, Washington, one of the reasons why Washington was chosen to lead the insurgent army, of course, was because he had great prestige, because he had already made a name for himself during the 7 Years' War when he fought alongside the English. But it was also because, as I was saying, the entire army was made up of New Englanders, and in order to get the southern states themselves to send troops, which they hadn't done spontaneously, it had been necessary to obtain a resolution from the first Congress, which had been assembled, to obtain military aid from the southern states, and to give a leader from Virginia to the U.S. Army was also a way of motivating them a little. The revolutionary impetus for independence really came from the North, from the Yankees, who dragged the others along with them, but who perhaps wouldn't have made the revolution on their own, in fact, even if they did follow. And that, I tell you, they gave great revolutionaries like Jefferson and Washington. So as I was saying, right from the start, there are two visions. Really, right from the start, you have Hamilton's vision, essentially, and therefore the idea that the federal government, and this was the birth of the Federalist Party, was the first American left, which said that you need a federal state that is strong, that is interventionist economy, that acts economically to stimulate through subsidies and tariffs the development of the American economy. Since Alexander Hamilton came from the North, as I said, was already a merchant, a trader, and a little industrial. Jefferson, on the other, had a vision conservative agrarian, which was to maintain a republic of small proprietors, advisors, who would all be free men, and which was a model rooted in the culture of the South, the culture of Virginia. And so that exists from the start. That's what you have, right? So in this perspective, when you look at the Civil War, you understand that it's the War of the South. You understand that it's a continuation of that. And that, in the end, the Civil War was the imposition of the Yankee way of thinking, in fact. In fact, the Southerners called the Northerners Yankees, but that's really what it's all about, i.e. the heart of American civilization, which is trying to impose itself, is the Northeast. And the American Civil War was born for the same fundamental reasons as the social war I mentioned earlier against Rome. In other words, in 2848, you had the American-Mexican War, which enabled the United States to definitively seize and protect it had started, but definitively to seize Texas, and which also enabled the United States to conquer California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico. In other words, all the southwestern states of the United States. In short, it includes the southwestern states and completes the U.S. territory. 2/3 of the volunteers who fought war, American volunteers, came from the southern states, right? You had 1/3 of the army made up of from north and 2/3 of the south. So we're in the same relationship, if you like, as the Italians who had allowed Rome to expand, who had fought for them, and who couldn't understand why they should, right, as the others. So, of course, the Northerners had, in theory, the same constitutional rights as Southerners. Conversely, Southerners had the same constitutional rights as Northerners. But in reality, in the way they were governed, this was not the case. Since the whole way of life, plantations, free trade with Europe in particular, since the idea was to sell cotton to Europe, which at the time was developing its textile industry, and therefore the slavery that went with plantation, free trade, all that, the North was fighting against it. Because in the North, it was Alexander Hamilton's conceptions that had been completely triumphant for decades, and increasing, and all the more so as development, economic and demographic growth in the North was far greater than in the South. And what the Southerners felt was that, on the one hand, they were giving their blood to the North to enable the United States in general to conquer territories which admittedly belonged to the Union as a whole. But in all these territories, once they had been conquered, i.e. these former Mexican territories, Spanish colonies, the North immediately said yes, but there will be no slavery. We'll have to stop with that question. Whereas the South, if they had wanted to take hold of this, their idea was what the theorists of Southern economics, Southern economic theorists. By the way, I think I've saved you a quote about the hope. About that. I read you this book, which is a very good book, James McPherson's Civil War, says this. I'll find it for you. Here it is. After the Senate had approved the treaty to acquire California and New Mexico, President Polk had outlined his next objective. I am resolutely in favor of buying Cuba and making it one of the states of this idea was particularly appealing to Southerners who saw an excellent way to extend the political path. The Pearl of the West Indies, with its 13 or 15 representatives in Congress, proclaimed a pamphlet in favor of annexation. It would be a powerful auxiliary for the South. The idea, if you like, really was to conquer other territories where they could develop slavery. That was the idea. It would enable them to rebalance their economic position, their ideological position, so to speak, within. And what the Yankees immediately said was, no, we must stop extending slavery and continue to pursue a policy that benefited the North. So, in reality, if you summarize, the idea was that they were giving their blood to conquer lands over which afterwards their opinion was not sought as the economic and social organization given, on the one hand, and on the other hand, they also gave their money, since the taxes and customs duties levied on the trade that the free traders in the South wanted were used to finance industry in the North, right? So it was really experienced as a kind of tribe that was levied by the North on the South. So the Americans was in fact the culmination of the North's domination of the whole of the United States. That's what it's really going to do. Turn the United States into a Yankee empire. That's the idea. And conversely, for the Confederates, the idea was to obtain equal rights. In both cases, we have secession, the creation of a confederation that mirrors the First Order, and the desire to create a totally competing order, but which at the same time is modeled on first, but which simply gives all equal rights to those who have created the confederation. So just as the social war consecrated the Roman aegis, the social war ended with the granting of Roman citizens, all free Italian isles. So if you like, militarily, the Italian Confederates lost, but they partly won ideologically. This is not the case of the Southerners, of course, but nonetheless, where they did win was in the fact that all the space they had promoted was now available to them, the space they had promoted for conquest. So that's the first part of the story. So that's the first stage, domination over a geographic area. And what's really interesting is that this first war creates the conditions for a civil war, which was to come later, which would transform the traditional regime. This regime I mentioned earlier, with its balance of power, with very liberal, etc., was to be transformed. What is its outcome? In Rome, it's obvious. The United States were not there. But what happens in first century Rome? Just after the end of the social war, you have what is known as the crisis of the Roman Republic, which lasted for some 60 years, culminating in the advent of the empire. It's not the territorial empire, it's the empire as a regime. This was a post-Roman Republican regime, which put an end to the Roman Republic by redistributing power, in particular by setting up an authoritarian government in which the army played a major role. And what we have to realize is that that's not the case after the Civil War, because you don't have a civil war that followed directly on from the Civil. In the United States, as you know, the Civil War is called the Civil War. Call it the Civil War. So it was true that it was partly a civil war, since it was people who off each other who clashed. Most of the major military figures in the Confederate and Union armies were people who had known each other, especially during the Mexican War. So there was indeed a civil war aspect, but I think the French term guerre de sécession is more interesting, precisely because it corresponds to this parallel with the social war in Rome, which is distinct from the civil war. The civil war began just afterwards and was, in fact, it's made possible in part by the aftermath of this social war, and it consists of a radicalization of a cleavage cleavage that had appeared in the second half of the 2nd century BC, which was the cleavage between what were called the Optimates and the Populares. So what was this? Well, what you need to know is that during the 3rd or 2nd century BC, you've got the whole series of Punic Wars, the wars against Carthage, and you've got this series of wars that are going to enable Rome to become the master of most of the Mediterranean, which led to an enormous influx of slaves into Italy, to the Romans, which would Roman economic system, because until then the Roman economy had been based on a group of small landowners, was based on a group of small landowners who were citizens. Most citizens were small landowners who had a farm which was exploited. Simply put, the Roman wars resulted in the annexation of a whole heap of land, which were then distributed among them by those closest power, i.e. the senators, and they decided to exploit slave labor in what are known as latifundia, which are large holdings. Plantations, by the way, where you have a slave productivity rate, but where labor labor costs so little, and where land requires so little capital investment, it's practically given to senators through a kind of subsidy, which is the fact that they put Roman citizens to work fighting the war, and then recoup the gain through annexations. This made it possible to set up a system that was much more profitable than the small landowner, and therefore simply put a lot of small landowners out of business, who found themselves ruined, and who therefore often went to Rome and swelled the ranks of the plebs in the land of the proletariat, again, to live more and more on what we just called social assistance through the mechanism of the anode, wound distributions, and so on. And that's it. This economic transformation, which to that sort of ancient globalization that was the establishment of Rome's reign over the Mediterranean port, is what led to the emergence of this divide between Optimates and Populares, i.e. the best on one side and the popular on the other, as it was called, which was to structure all Roman politics until the end of the Civil War. And that's how it began. That's how the Greeks in particular, who sought to promote agrarian reform, who were tribunes of the people, the plebs, about there. Tribunes of the plebs promoting social reforms. In other words, redistribution, firstly of land, then various forms of social aid. But let's make no mistake, it wasn't the rich against the poor. There are many more poor than rich. So on one side it was the senators and their clients in the political sense, both, etc., who were in favor of maintaining Roman laws and traditions and the supremacy of. They were conservatives in the broadest sense of the term, and that's what you have to understand. They weren't just fighting. It wasn't just those with a vested interest in maintaining that order that they were doing. It's as in any political order like ours. There could be people who are conservative for purely fiscal. They don't want to. Conservatives prioritize fiscal responsibility, but also align themselves with broader conservative values like morality. This expands their focus beyond just finances. So it goes far beyond those who are strictly interested in a political position from an economic point of view. So you had the wealthy senators, and you had all those who were simply attached to Roman traditions, who preferred to stand shoulder to shoulder with the senators, who wanted above all to preserve their wealth, to face up to people who, while they might want to help the poor, were sometimes honest conservatives, but at the cost of what they saw as the destruction of the traditional order. So all conservative progressive struggles go beyond simple interest. But interest is structuring for core on both. So the core of the Populares, on the other hand, so it was people who had been ruined by who were demanding welfare, who wanted money, who wanted land distribution, and so on. So people who were in favor of economic distribution. But it was also, in general, all those who were in favor of what they call progress, i.e. the extension of rights, and in particular, therefore, at the base, the extension of citizenship rights to Italians, therefore, at the base, extension of citizenship rights to Italians, therefore, at the base, extension of citizenship rights to Italians, therefore, at the base, citizenship rights to Italians. So before the social war, this was already something that was promoted by the leaders of the Populares, particularly a tribune called Lucius Drusus, who was himself assassinated for trying to push to allow the city. It was his assassination, moreover, that provoked the secession and confederation of the Italians, because they were refused full Roman citizenship. So there you have the two camps. And among the Populares, of course, you also have leaders from the senatorial aristocracy, whose interests might be thought lie in defending the economic model that allows them to be very, very rich, legissimos, but who, for reasons of political careerism, prefer to defend the poor and lean on the poor and rely on the proletarians. So that's the great divide that will structure the civil war. Quite simply, between the Greeks and the social war, it's all about political struggle. Alright, there are assassinations like those of the Greeks because they tried to make a show of force, but it doesn't generate yet. It doesn't degenerate until the day after the war. The social, why not? Precisely because the social war will add another an upheaval, the addition of Italian citizens, a new clientele in particular for the Populares, and above all, the emergence of violence in society since this social war led to a form of civil war in Italy, which would then be prolonged in the civil wars in French Switzerland. So is there a parallel with this in the United States? So in terms of the Optimates Populares divide, yes, already there's a cleavage that's possible, since in fact it's been close to the Republican-Democrat divide since, let's say, the 1960s, since the fight for civil rights was particularly helped by the Democrats, and especially the social fight with Johnson's Great Society, i.e. economic redistribution towards the poorest, and in particular the black populations. Johnson himself said that thanks to his social measures for the black population, he had won the black vote from the Democrats for 200 years, because he used a more energetic term than his private Johnson. And 60 years later, we're in a situation where we're still heading in that direction, because we're talking more and more about the threat of socialism erupting states. Poor whites in the United States, who may be poor, who, despite being poor and sometimes ruined by globalization, vote for Trump because they don't want that. In other words, you have Americans who remain attached to the American Constitution, including people who are poor and who might have some gain financially from redistribution policy, but who don't want it, mainly because they are attached to their freedom, the American way of life, and the possibility of enriching themselves through their own work. On the other hand, there are socialist demands that are becoming more and more radical new generation, in particular Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and so on. So we have a divide that is quite similar, in fact, and which has the same causes above all. That's what's interesting, because I've explained to you what had ruined a large part of the traditional Roman middle class and led to the birth of this new divide. In the end, what we're saying is pretty close to what we're saying about globalization, the effect of globalization in the United States, and what Trump is saying when he explains that bad deals, especially with China, have ruined the traditional American class. American middle class, we have the same economic causes, let's say, which generate the same political effects. But then, as I said, in Rome, the social war served as a trigger for the civil war. But that's not the case in the USA, of course, because in the USA, this secessionist crisis happened much earlier in the process than in Rome. Nevertheless, what's causing the serious tensions today and the specter of civil war in the United States are many things inherited from the American Civil War. All the overturning of Confederate status in the South comes from all the racial problems that have arisen stem from this heritage. It's been pointed out enough in the media. Black Lives Matter, you get the impression, listen to the people who are Black Lives Matter, that we're in the aftermath of the Civil War. You get the impression that they've just won their freedom and have some kind of revenge to take immediately, whereas it's 150 years later. But sometimes politics has that effect. It can freeze an effect that resurfaces when the conditions are right. Apparently, the conditions are right. It's as if civil rights hadn't been granted. It's as if we'd just come out of segregation. And so, in spite of this lapse of time, we realize that the problems that arose at the time are indeed problems that were created by the American political order. At the end of the American Civil War, the slaves are out, slavery is over, in the same way that at the end of the social war, citizenship is given to all residents of Italy. While in Rome this leads to difficulties and immediate political upheaval, in the American context it's different. So why is it different? I think in particular if it produces this delayed effect, because despite everything, the black population has remained, since it hasn't changed, its proportion hasn't changed the population, practically not, it seems, since the end of the Civil War. So the black population has remained. It must be about the same as the population, so it's still a small minority. That wasn't enough to bring about a political upheaval. On the scale of Rome, where the number of citizens doubled, simply by extending full Roman citizenship to the male inhabitants of Italy, the population doubled. Giving citizenship, freedom and voting rights, black populations, the aftermath of the Civil War didn't that. It created an additional population, but it's very inferior. Why is it waking up now? I think it's largely due to the very high levels of immigration over the last 40, particularly in territories that were annexed at the time of the Civil War, which I used to call California, etc., all those states of the former Greater. This has led to a social situation today that there's a community, a kind of community of struggle between racial minorities, between Latinos and blacks, and the Democratic Party is playing on that. They talk about minorities all the time, about the Latino minority and the black minority, and that allows them to reach a proportion of the electorate. It's getting close to half the US population. I believe that in 20 years' time, the white population in the United States will have become a minority, a slight minority, around around half. In other words, it will no longer be the majority as it has been until now. I think it's this demographic effect, the very strong migration last years, which hasn't increased the black population, but which has created a population that's a little bit in the situation, since the Latino population, sociologically speaking, is very often on a par with the black population. They very often vote for the Democrats for the same. Very often they must have had the same menial jobs and so on. So that's why the Democratic Party today screws the black minority wasn't enough to make up half the electorate, but now it has. And so at this point we find ourselves in a situation that is politically and demographically that of Rome at the end of the Social War, even if we are 100 years after the Social War. So what does that mean? It means that if we're like Rome, we're indeed on the brink of civil war, since that's where the crisis of the Roman Republic began. So we're probably on the verge of the crisis of the Republic, and indeed we can see that it's beginning. It's been going on for some time. It's been going on at least since the election of Barack Obama, because now, every time you have a president elected, you have a protest movement on the other side of the aisle that rejects his legitimacy. For Obama, it was the Tea Party. For Donald Trump's election, it was the whole Not My President movement, and so we're really seeing a radicalization of the struggle. So I'm afraid we're actually on the way of this mechanics, at least, of what would be a crisis of the American Republic, which would be equivalent to the crisis of the Roman Republic, and which only ended up being resolved by the advent of a new power, an authoritarian power,